In this lecture, we'll be doing some background information on the Soviet Union under Josef Stalin. The death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924 left something of a power vacuum in the Soviet Union. He was only 53 years old when he died and hadn't really prepared for a successor, although a series of strokes left him increasingly debilitated the last 2 years of his life. The two main competitors for leadership of the Soviet Union after the death of Lenin were Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Stalin was born Josef Jugashvili. He was ethnically a Georgian from the Caucasus region. At one point he was convicted of bank robbery. He was arrested and exiled at least 7 times and kept escaping and returning back to the cities in the West, Russian cities in the West. He took on the name at some point of Stalin, which translates into Man of Steel. Trotsky, on the other hand, was much more of a theorist, as opposed to Stalin, who was much more of a street-level organizer and something of a thug. He was a doctrinaire Marxist. He called for worldwide revolution against capitalism, whereas Stalin was pushing for what he called socialism in one country. Stalin had a distinct advantage, despite the fact that Trotsky was probably intellectually far superior to him, and that was that he had the ability to put his supporters in top jobs, and through personnel decisions really kept Trotsky isolated in the Communist Party. Finally, push came to shove, and Stalin was able to first force Leon Trotsky out of the country, and he was later murdered in Mexico by an agent of Stalin in 1937. After gaining full control of the party, Stalin put together the first of what he called 5-year plans, and pushing the Soviet Union more towards a command economy. The goal is to build heavy industry, to improve transportation, and raise farm output. The government from this point forward controlled all economic activity. Interestingly, this was quite a change from the policies enacted by Lenin in the last few years of his life. Lenin had undertaken what he called the new economic policy, which was essentially a return to forms of capitalism. Lenin believed the Soviet Union was not ready for a full communist revolution, and that it had to go through a fully advanced capitalism to get to communism. Stalin, on the other hand, disagreed with that policy. This idea of the command economy, governments own all businesses, they distribute all resources. They would dictate from the top down how much of a given product a factory would produce, or how much crops a particular farming concern would produce. Very often these quotas were far beyond reality and almost into the realm of fantasy, and yet magically bureaucrats managed to meet those quotas, at least on paper, but there was quite a bit of corruption and fudging of numbers going along with that. Yet despite the inefficiencies of the Soviet economic system and the widespread corruption, industrial production did increase by approximately 25% in the period from 1928 to 1937, which far surpassed the shrinking economies in the West, which was going through the Great Depression at the time. The downside of this, of course, though, is to pay for these unrealistic quotas and to boost industrial production, consumer goods had to be cut back on. So there were severe shortages of food, clothing, and housing in this time period. One of the most important ways that Stalin was able to boost industrial production is through the collectivization of agriculture. He needed farmers to produce more grain to feed urban workers, and he needed more grain to sell abroad to raise foreign cash reserves. Stalin was also somewhat paranoid of small farmers and peasants who he believed to be inherently conservative and thus a threat to the regime. Collectives were large farms that were owned and operated by peasants as a group. The government provided tractors and fertilizer and seed. Peasants learned modern farming methods. They were allowed to keep houses and personal belongings, but they were forced to turn over quotas in terms of the amount of grain or whatever it is they were producing on their farm. Animals and implements were turned over to the collectives, which again operated almost as an arm of the state. The state set prices, controlled supplies. Peasants quickly became upset by this, especially with the low crop prices that the government dictated. In many cases, they would burn crops or kill animals and destroy tools rather than turn this over to the government. There was a term that emerged as a pejorative or as a slur against independent-minded farmers, which was kulak, K-U-L-A-K. And Stalin thought kulaks were behind the resistance. He believed that this greed had to be dealt with. So in 1929, he undertook what he called the liquidation of the kulaks. He confiscated their land, sent them to labor camps. But yet peasants continued to hold back grain. And Soviets had to send operatives out into the countryside to seize the grain to meet the urban needs. Due to this kulak policy and a poor 1932 harvest, along with a drought in this harvesting season, there was mass famine in the period of 1932 and 3. Perhaps as many as 8 million peasants died in the Ukraine as a result of these failed policies. One of the ways Stalin was able to maintain power is through the use of police terror. They monitored telephone lines, read mail, installed systems of informants, neighbors denouncing neighbors, family members denouncing family members, and the government actively encouraged citizens to denounce other citizens. Censorship, again, was a principal means by which control was maintained in the Soviet Union under Stalin. There was no room for individual creativity. Soviets controlled newspapers, motion pictures, theater, radio, and all sources of information. One of the strangest periods of Soviet history occurs in 1936 to 38 in what is known as the Great Purge. Stalin, increasingly paranoid, began to believe there was this vast threat to overthrow the regime. Evidence doesn't appear to back this up. I think this was largely the creation of Stalin's paranoid mind. Political rivals, military leaders, intellectuals were all rounded up. There were up to 2 million arrested, and we believe up to 1 million were executed. In Stalin's own hand, we can directly link at least 44,000 deaths where he signed off on forms ordering the death of people believed to be threats to the regime. So in terms of these show trials, these were trials of a couple of leading so-called ringleaders. Western journalists were brought in to try to give this some legitimacy, and at the time some Western news agencies did believe these were fair trials. In hindsight, of course, we know now that they were shams, that people were tortured and beaten or threatened in order to get them to confess publicly. One of the downsides, though, to the Great Purge is that almost all of the top military leaders of the Soviet Union were jailed or executed just at the time when Hitler was beginning to build up the German military. So this left the Soviet Union at the start of the Second World War in dire straits with a lack of talented and experienced military leaders. In terms of religion, the Russian Orthodox Church was the main target of persecution. The Soviets attempted to sort of eliminate religion and replace it with communist ideology. This was not very effective in the long term. In the short term, it seemed to drive religion underground. but the religious character of the Russian people is such that it was never really extinguished. Roman Catholics also were persecuted, as well as Jews, to a lesser extent Muslims. The Soviets seem to have less animosity, at least during the Stalinist era, with sort of some of the borderland peoples who were in the outlying republics of the Muslim faith. And this in part was due to the fact that they needed to be, the Soviets that is, needed to be a bit more accommodating in order to pacify these peoples. The Soviets instituted a state prison system known as the GULAG System. The acronym stands for the Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps and Colonies. There were both prison camps, labor camps, as well as colonies. Colonies were places that were sort of lower risk but permanently exiled individuals would be sent in order to start over, but they couldn't leave those colonies. They had to stay. Most of these were, the colonies that is, were in underpopulated areas of Siberia and Eastern Russia. The labor camps themselves could be all over the Soviet Union. The next slide will see a map of the Gulag system. Here you have statistics. You can see that during the Second World War, the number of prisoners significantly dropped, and that's due to the common sense reason that Stalin simply needed more Soviet citizens to fight in the military. Here's the map showing where the various labor camps and prison camps were located. It essentially devolved into a form of slave labor in the Soviet Union. This officially, this system was dissolved in 1960 under Nikita Khrushchev, although vestiges of this system remained until the fall of the Soviet Union.